Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to run everyone through a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, only the host will be able to see the list of all attendees. All participants' lines will be muted to ensure there is no background noise. Following our presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. If you have a question at any time for our speakers during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your questions at the end of the session. For any questions our speakers won't have time to answer today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the event. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slides within the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We are joined by MarkMonitor experts Olesia, Klevchuk, and Bahun. Olesia is a senior product marketing manager at MarkMonitor, responsible for the brand protection and anti-piracy suites of products. In her role, Olesia focuses on understanding challenges around brand protection, digital piracy, and IP abuse faced by global brands both online and in the mobile space. Olesia has over 10 years of experience working in the IT sector, helping global brands understand how technologies can improve their businesses. In more recent years, she focused on ways online data and technologies can protect brands and intellectual property online. Sam joined the MarkMonitor team through the acquisition of DetectNet in December 2012. He has over 12 years of experience in the content protection and copyright enforcement space. He has worked closely with a number of content owners in the film, TV, music, and software industries to measure and manage the illegal consumption of their content on P2P and the web. His experience spans both technical and business roles related to litigation, evidence collection, graduated response notice programs, countermeasures, and business intelligence data. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Olesia to get us started.
Thank you, Gina. So today we'll be talking about P2P networks and how piracy has been developing in the P2P network. So our agenda for today is I will start you off by talking about P2P landscape, its history, and any recent developments that will be relevant to know about. Then I will pass on to Sam, who will take you through various methods available for detection and verification of unauthorized content available on P2P sites, as well as best practices around enforcement strategies that you can take when dealing with piracy on those networks. And then we will spend some time talking about any alternatives to enforcement and what else that you can do on the top of looking at the ways of removing content. So with that, I want to start us off by looking at the P2P landscape and the recent developments. Before we look at P2P networks in particular, I want to look at the history of the piracy overall, because I think it's worthwhile understanding this history and to see its relationship to other technologies that are impacting piracy space. Well, first of all, I want to take us back to 1995 when Usenet has became very popular, and although by today's numbers, 16 million users might not sound high, it was back in 1995. It's still actually functioning today, and there's around 5 million users that are still accessing those networks to share content and various files. Around 2000, Napster brought P2P to masses. It was available largely for music files, but it managed to reach around 25 million users before it was taken down. After that, around 2005, we started to see a peak of P2P networks as we know them today. And today they're picking at around 300 million users, and that's a very large number indeed. The only kind of type of media that seems to be overtaking the P2P file sharing is the streaming media. There's around 1 billion plus users of streaming videos or streaming music today. And of course, this is not just illegal use, this includes the legal use as well. And as we see all the shifts and developments in the way consumers are accessing content online, piracy seems to be following this trend as well, from Usenet to Napster to P2P and now to the streaming platform. So going back into and focusing on the P2P networks in particular, the first generation of P2P networks was Napster and eDonkey 2000, and as I already mentioned, Napster was what brought P2P to the mass users. The first generation, this kind of first generation of P2P networks was different to what we know today. It was the users were able to connect to a server, and this is how they would access and share their content. Once piracy problem became obvious on those networks, it was this kind of centralized system of access that led to its shutdown. So all that was needed to do was take down the server, and the centralized network went down as well. The second generation of P2P networks learned from that and developed a new way to share files without kind of the centralized system. So it developed a decentralized system where users are able to connect to each other to share the content. And that, of course, made it very difficult to shut it down if there's no central place where you can go or that stores content or that will allow you to take down the network. Kazaa and Gnutella, Torrent sites are probably some of the most popular P2P networks. They have attracted millions of users around the globe. Despite its popularity of the P2P networks, the use of P2P networks does require some level of technical ability. You need to be able to download the software. It's not always user-friendly or intuitive to use. It's very often plagued by a number of pop-ups or malware or any other kind of things that carry out significant risk to the end users. And the less technically savvy the user is, the more vulnerable they will be in using this kind of technology to access content. There is a third generation of P2P networks that we are seeing today, and that's something that is developing on the dark net, where you need additional software to get into, and what that allows the users is more of anonymity about who they are, and they're able to download and access content pretty much anonymously. So one of the things that we do a lot is on P2P networks is we're able to identify the actual users of those networks. This kind of third generation is not allowing us to do that. But what I do want to talk about next is this kind of new P2P piracy that we're starting to see. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the uptake of the streaming content and the popularity of the streaming content kind of started to spill over into the P2P world as well. We see the development of these new types of platforms, such as Popcorn Time, that allow users to access to the files that are available via P2P networks, but they can access it instantaneously via streaming technologies. It often requires very little to no technical ability at all. It offers a very attractive, user-friendly interface, which makes users more comfortable in using it, and but it still remains a BitTorrent-powered kind of software that makes enforcement challenging, as we know is in the P2P space as a whole. So looking into the Popcorn Time in particular, and what the Popcorn Time has been all about, well, Popcorn Time is, first of all, is an open source software. There are a lot of developers that can get access to the source and build their own platforms on top of that. In the US alone, we saw the software being downloaded into the millions of devices and became very popular quite very quickly. It looks just like a real thing. You can see a small screenshot over there. It looks very similar to some of the popular official, legitimate streaming platforms. And the content that is available on the Popcorn Time very often is available before before it's available on any of the legitimate sites, which attracts those who don't want to wait for the release on an official channel. There are challenges in enforcing on this platform. Since, of course, it doesn't host anything, or and it is powered by the BitTorrent software. In October, the site was actually successfully taken down, but over Thanksgiving break, another fork was developed and popped back up. So the software is again is still available today. So when looking at the actual popularity of P2P sites and its adoption, well, the adoption of P2P sites is very, very widespread. And it's especially interesting to compare it to other popular platforms that consumers are using today around the internet. BitTorrent is pretty much as popular as Twitter today. It's about 1/5 of Facebook users would potentially be using BitTorrent, and it's more than 4 times as popular as Netflix, which is one of the most popular legitimate streaming platforms available today. Looking at these numbers, you really can't neglect the levels of adoption and popularity of the technology. And thinking about it, those 300 million users are today responsible for almost 7 billion infringements every year, and that goes across TV shows, movies, music, software, games, books, all sorts of different files. So what you're looking at here is the trend that we saw at the end of last year and earlier this year in terms of the number of infringements that we found on popular P2P networks. Although the trend might look to you pretty flat, it's still billions of infringements every quarter, and that should attract your attention. The number has been very consistent over the past quarters and maybe years. It's not really growing, but it's not declining much either. And P2P today, looking at this number, P2P today remains one of the most popular ways to get access to pirated media. So where does most of the infringement take place? Well, spread around the world. There's about 13% of infringements that we see come from the U.S. 18% come from Asia, and you can see a very large number, 46%, and that's kind of Europe plus Russia, and it's the Russian piece that makes that number so high. We do see a lot of infringement coming from that area. The last thing I want to talk to you about when it comes to the popular trends in the P2P space is how pirates are monetizing on this content and how they're making money out of this. Well, there are 2 numbers in front of you, and that's the data of profits that Piracy had from various platforms, whether that's P2P torrent sites or streaming and so forth. So you can see that back in 2013, 50% of all ad revenue generated by pirated sites came from torrents, and 50% came from all others. By 2014, the number shrunk to 38%, and that's largely because most of the attention is now shifting towards streaming media. However, at the same time, you need to still remember that although that number is might look like it's decreasing in proportion to other places, BitTorrent portals continue to generate more ad revenue than any other portal sites or platforms out there. With that, I would like to pass this on to Sam to take you through the detection and enforcement strategies.
Thanks, Olesia. Let me here we go. Okay, so I'd like to switch the topic a little bit to talking about detection and verification, some of the different components involved with those 2 pieces. In terms of detection, our focus is on the 4 major peer-to-peer networks that exist today: BitTorrent, eDonkey, Gnutella, and Aries. Those networks, the way the detection is set up is to interact with the network very similar to the way an end user would participate in downloading content from these networks. The difference is we do it at a much larger scale. So in terms of monitoring, we regularly monitor millions of users worldwide on these networks. The monitoring we do is fully compliant with the standards of the EU directive as well as all applicable U.S. laws regarding evidence collection. And those things are important. I mean, large scale, but following all of the standards that are required so that the data being collected can be used by content owners in various applications. On the enforcement side, I mean, we are the vendor of choice for many of the largest anti-piracy programs, and with that comes compliance with a number of local regulations. So while the standards for evidence collection are one piece, there can be different regulations, country by country or market by market, that may cause some slight variations in the actual approach to sending notices or enforcement. On the compliance side, the main focus is really sending the notices to the correct ISP. So we give constant attention to IP blocks that are changing and updating the database that we keep for that, as well as contact information at ISPs in order to make sure that when the notices are sent, they're getting to the most accurate place that they need to get to. We also provide call center service to help handle consumer inquiries as well as questions from ISPs can occasionally come in. Our team is trained to handle any of the technical questions that typically come through from those, and that can be a significant piece because the volumes of notices we're talking about with a typical peer-to-peer program are thousands and thousands of notices. So having a way to manage and address inquiries when they come in is an important piece of it. And finally, reporting. I mean, the data that you get from peer-to-peer networks, and I think Olesia will go into some more of this a little bit later, but it's very granular. It can be very valuable to analyze and understand what's going on with piracy on peer-to-peer networks. So we focus a lot of effort on reporting geographic information, reporting around the content itself, so by title, by type, genre. There can be a number of things actually at the content level when you're looking at the quality or the audio or subtitle language. There's a number of things that can be analyzed there, as well as in the case of notice programs specifically, there's oftentimes notice quotas related to specific ISPs or within certain countries. So having accurate reporting to keep you updated on the latest and greatest through your notice program is pretty important. Now, in terms of verification, oftentimes with peer-to-peer, verification actually is in reference to 2 different things. There's file verification, and then there's kind of the peer or case verification. On the file verification side, the method used for that is basically, the file verification is in reference to the method that's used to verify the actual file that exists on the network that peers are exchanging back and forth. So we're talking about a video file or a music file or software. In that case, there's really kind of two primary methods that are applied. The first is human verification, where we would download a full copy and analysts would actually review those files to determine if they match exactly with the content or the copyrighted asset that we're scanning for. The second method that is sometimes used is fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is basically where we would still download a full copy, but we would work with content owners to build a reference fingerprint or a database of reference fingerprints, and those files would be matched against those reference fingerprints to determine whether they are in fact matching and infringing on the copyrighted asset. The second piece of verification is peer verification or case verification. There's a number of terms around this, but essentially it's referring to the method that's used to verify each peer that's discovered in a swarm. and basically the method that determines that the peer is participating in the swarm and infringing on the file. For this verification, it gets a little bit more complicated, not too much, but there's a little bit of history here. When peer-to-peer started to evolve several years ago, I mean, naturally there were a number of content owners that were interested in protecting their assets on those networks. There's a lot of evolution in the networks themselves, and kind of the way or the technical nature of each network, as well as there were different vendors that had different approaches to collecting this type of data. So about 8 years ago, a company called Movie Labs published a document. They basically set out on a research project to gather information from different content owners, different vendors all over, and understand all the various techniques and methods that were used to collect this type of data. They took all that information and basically published a document that kind of standardized the verification levels into 7 different categories. While this is not like a strict rule that's followed, there is oftentimes references to these 7 levels of verification. You just keep in mind that there is some flexibility and certainly some customization. So, it's not a strict rule that has to be followed. But speaking to the 7 verification levels that they identified, step 1 or level 1 is essentially just going to the networks and collecting IP addresses. There is some variation from network to network, but it's a pretty simple process, less resource intensive in terms of servers and scale that's needed in order to collect this type of data. Level 2 takes it one step further, and you'll see as I go through this list, each level basically just adds kind of an additional layer, or in some cases maybe a couple different techniques for the data collection, just to further verify and collect additional evidence to support the fact that an infringement is occurring. So at level 2, once the IP addresses are collected, basically you would ping the IP address to make sure that there's life on the other end. That's level 2. Level 3 would again take it a step further and actually communicate with the IP and port through some type of message sent, depending again on the specific peer-to-peer protocol we're talking about. Send some type of message, receive a message back confirming that IP and port has a machine or a person on the other end using a peer-to-peer client. These first 3 levels are really the primary levels that are used for peer-to-peer business intelligence. Sometimes it will be referred to as demand data. There are a variety of terms, but essentially these 3 are not typically viewed as having enough evidence to support notice sending. Because with each of these, there can be some, spoofed IPs or things that, or other variations at different levels that, most content owners would not want present for a notice sending program. When you move into level 4 and level 5, these are really the ideal verification levels for notice sending. Level 4 takes things a step further and basically establishes a connection between the peer and the in this case us, the vendor, collecting this information. And there's a communication process. All of these steps that I'm mentioning here, keep in mind that there's evidence being collected, at every step of the process. So log files and, other records to support these steps have been carried out and can be used as evidence later. But at level 4, that's probably the most common level of verification that's typically used for a notice sending program. Level 5 takes it one step further and actually downloads a piece of the file from that individual peer. Again, I would say that's the next most common for notice sending, but does require additional resources. And each step, as you go up the scale here, each step you take does impact the volume of peers that you're able to collect from the swarm, just because of, the requirements that are placed on that. And so, you typically see a slight decrease in volume as you kind of go up the scale here. So that's level 5. When you get into level 6 and level 7, it's important to note these levels of verification are very unnatural for the peer-to-peer networks. They've been designed to function in a way that these two don't work very well, but it is still possible, and we do collect data at these levels. Level 6 is basically just, instead of just downloading a piece, you're downloading several pieces, enough to assemble a portion of the file that is functional. So in the case of a video, it can be, a portion of the video could be played. And then level 7, which is the most extreme, would be downloading the full file from one individual peer on the network. And as I said, that's such a strict requirement. The volumes are significantly reduced when you're required to collect that type of evidence. And these last two, 6 and 7, are really mostly, employed for evidence collection in support of some type of litigation or some other type of special project where, high level of evidence and verification is required. Now, I want to switch over to talking a little bit more about the enforcement aspect of it. This map here shows, a map of the world. Basically, the countries highlighted in red indicate countries where there are clear legal procedures or business practices for notice sending programs. Excuse me. You can see that the U.S. Is in red. Canada, as of January of this year, passed a law that makes things significantly better there for notice sending. France, the UK, in Europe, and then in Asia, you've got Japan and South Korea. These are countries where there's legislation in place, or there may be some type of practice that's been put in place that content owners can leverage to make sure that the notice sending that is sent to those ISPs in those countries, that something will be done with them. And what that is varies from country to country, but at least that there's some attention given to it. Now, there's a lot of blue on this map, which makes it look like there aren't a lot of options through most of the world. There are ISPs in other countries that are compliant with sending notices on to the end users or taking some type of action. They do it voluntarily. So we can certainly work with content owners to identify those types of ISPs and customize a program so that we're sending to those. You also probably noticed Australia is in gray. Australia, as well as a few others, Australia is just kind of an obvious one right now. There's a number of countries that are having discussions around this type of topic right now, and there's legislation that is being reviewed or being discussed, and hopefully will be put in place soon to help with this. A few things you want to consider before engaging in notice sending for peer-to-peer. First is geography. So I just mentioned the different countries that have legislation or practices in place that can be leveraged. Keep in mind, notices can be sent worldwide. There's no technical challenge there, but they're not likely to reach the end users without that supporting legislation in place. So it's something you want to be mindful of when you're embarking on a notice program, just to make sure that the resources you're putting into it are wisely spent. The second is program goals. A lot of notice programs may actually have all of these, or there could be some other ones that aren't listed. But education, the legal perspective, and enforcing on the copyright, converting people from using illegal or consuming content illegally, converting them over to a legal source, are all goals that many people have for these programs. And so understanding each of those goals and, figuring out kind of how those would be prioritized and how to make sure that those goals are being met by the program is an important step. And that ties right into the next point, which is notice language. The notice language is really important because, as I mentioned earlier, countries can vary based on regulations and some of the legal statements that are required in the notices. So you really want to think about, how the notice is worded and make sure it matches up with your goals. From an educational standpoint, you can provide resources in the notice that may be useful to end users. In some cases, there may be links that are provided directly to the content that was infringing related to the notice. In other cases, maybe a link to a broader page that provides the majority or a large portion of the content that you own to allow users to find new paths to get to legal content. And then the last is graduated response type programs. These programs have been around a number of years, but are certainly continuing to become more popular. These are really, in some cases, it can be based on legislation, but many of them are based on voluntary private agreements between, content owners and ISPs. That is something that we've seen in a number of countries. The success of that is starting to grow. But keep in mind that, it's not limited to countries like France or South Korea that have managed this more from a government perspective, but individual content owners, you may have relationships with an ISP on the business side for legitimate distribution. You may be able to leverage that in some way to, get them to agree to handle your notices and follow certain protocols for that. Those types of things come with quite a bit of customization, but our system has been designed to handle all of that. So whether it's notice quotas, whether it's certain IP ranges, there's really very, very few limits in terms of how that can be customized and set up for specific ISPs. So graduated response programs are something that definitely should be considered for any notice program. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olesia.
Thank you, Sam. So Sam took us through different methods of enforcement that you can implement. I want to talk about an alternative use for this P2P data that you will be collecting when going through the network. So when it comes to a typical anti-piracy program, you can break it down into 3 parts pretty easily, and a very simple part. You start with detecting your content, then you want to verify that it is actually, in fact, pirated content, and then go through some kind of enforcement or remediation that you have in place. What we find is that with a P2P network, sometimes it might pay off to introduce another step that will make the data that you collect from the P2P networks a lot more useful, and that's the analyze step. It's the step that can either follow the verify step or run parallel to enforcement, or a lot of customers that we work with actually do it in place of enforcement. This is the way for you to get access to the data, make sense of that data, and use that data to really drive insights to convert potential pirates and divert them to the legal content available elsewhere. So understand the demand for media files that you have, and understand maybe the reasons why something is being pirated in specific regions, languages, or quality of the files, and try to rectify the situation by providing them with the legal content. So what kind of data do you have available at your disposal to do that? Well, P2P probably provides some of the reaches data out there. You can really dive in and look at the quality of the files being shared, the language, the content, all sorts of different data. Think about it as a way of taking the price completely out of the equation and looking for a real demand for your content and for your product. You can, of course, supplement that data by looking at the cyber lockers or whatever you might find on the search engines, and that data is also really good, but we often find that it's not as rich in and not as deep as the one that we can collect on the P2P side. What makes it a really powerful tool in particular is when it's combined with a more traditional sources of media consumption, and that could be sales data that you already have in place, your distribution data, where and how you distribute your content around the world, and any audience data that you might have, including just the demographics and the profiles of your potential customers. So what you can expect to find, what kind of data you can expect to find, as I already mentioned, the quality, the language, the type of a content, even going into the details of geographies and what particular networks or ISPs that are involved in sharing particular types of files. You can even sometimes compare downloading versus streaming and how customers are finding and getting access to those files. So what is their unique customer journey, if you like, to find that. And then, of course, your files and your content is not the only one being pirated. Once you start benchmarking it against your peers or industry averages, you can really get an idea of how and why your content being pirated more or less in specific regions or in specific languages, or if there's a specific type of file that's being particularly more popular in the pirated landscape, and then you can start analyzing as to why that might be the case. And we have already seen quite a bit of success with some of our customers who've been implementing and really using this data as an alternative use. I want to take you through one interesting example that we have of a software company. They were really struggled with the visibility into the piracy market, and couldn't figure out the availability of the pirated copies of the proprietary software. What they could do is they could easily track their own software, as their own software had kind of an ability to communicate with the company's authentication service, so they knew who was using their software and whether or not they paid for them. However, the availability of cracked and hacked copies of the software that was not communicating back to the authentication service provided this blind spot, and it was not visible to them. So we used our tools and technology to uncover those copies of the hacked software and provided them with the details around those files available on the P2P network. So we were able to dive into the actual factual information about the P2P demand, the geolocation of P2P users, and as well as various file characteristics that we could collect from those networks. What's interesting is that this particular company did not actually enforce on illegitimate copies of the software they found, but they rather used the data they collected as an actionable intelligence to generate leads and for the marketing and sales teams. And they used those leads to drive extra business and to drive extra revenues. They had quite a lot of success in getting to those infringers and asking them to pay for the pirated products they have already downloaded and were using illegally. In fact, they have actually fed this into their sales teams and developed tactics to win this additional business and built it into the sales quarters as a result as well. So a very good success story there for using piracy data. And just to sum this up, more in general, the way you can use this data is very wide. Of course, you can look at it as a way to enhance your anti-piracy strategy and figure out how and where you want to target your program. You can estimate and differentiate the potential causes of infringements across various demographics. You can measure and forecast the impact of technology on various infringement methods and so forth. One of the other applications which I already talked about is, of course, converting pirates to pay or discourage these casual pirates that might not be able to find or easily access legal copies elsewhere. So kind of redirecting them away from piracy towards the legitimate content and providing them with a better experience and therefore increasing your revenues. Because the data is so rich and because there's so much of it, you can actually really easily use this to make smarter business decisions around the distribution of your content and identify any gaps in specific markets where piracy is particularly high, and it might be due to the fact that you don't distribute your content into this market. You can look into the market and improving your marketing by looking into the demand for and the popularity of certain titles that you have, and kind of make better decisions about whether that's pricing or promotion, sales of this content. And by learning from what's happened in your previous releases, you can really anticipate and prepare for any shifts in piracy that might occur. So by directing your customers towards this legitimate content and encouraging them to pay for it will really kind of help you to recover those lost revenues and a lot of the time create even additional revenue streams, as we saw in an example just earlier on. So I think with that, I'm going to pass this back to Gina, who's going to take us through some questions that we might have had.
All right, great. Thank you, Olesia and Sam. We did have some questions come in. As a reminder, if you have any questions, just submit them through the Q&A tab on your screen. So the first question we had is, aside from BitTorrent, how much activity do you see on the other 3 P2P networks?
I'll be happy to take that one. So it's a good question. I mean, BitTorrent is definitely the largest of the networks. I think that there's plenty of data to support that. So when we look at the other 3, eDonkey, Berries, and Gnutella, really, the popularity varies a little bit based on geography and content type. eDonkey is definitely the closest second place contender. It has a lot more popularity in Europe than it does in the U.S., and there's pretty widespread content types available on eDonkey. In terms of the final 2, Aries is probably third, with, again, quite a bit of content across different types, film, TV, music, software, etc. But it does tend to be more popular in Spanish-speaking countries, and we definitely see trends there. It is probably worth noting in terms of content, we do see a little bit more, I would say, activity for music content than we do for a lot of other content types, but there's certainly a widespread menu of content available on there. And then Gnutella is last. Gnutella has tried to die a couple times, but keeps coming back. So there's still some activity we see on that network, but certainly the smallest, I think, of all the networks that we see.
Great. So the next question, how should we address piracy on sites like Popcorn Time?
I can start by answering this question, and then I'll see if Sam has anything to add. This is a pretty hard question to answer, and I think there's a number of different strategies that you can take, and it's probably very hard to take content off or enforce on the sites like Popcorn Time or taking Popcorn Time down itself. So while it might prove challenging to enforce on sites like this, you should be treated similar way that you would work with any other torrent site. The content owners will have options to collect information about users and then work with ISPs sending notices to them as a part of your notice sending program. In addition to that, you can take some alternative measures to see if you can attract your viewers towards legitimate platforms and really divert them away from the platforms like Popcorn Time. The usual technologies of downloading or Blu-rays, DVDs, and they're becoming more and more obsolete, and there's a clear shift towards the streaming platforms, and that's why platforms like Popcorn Time are gaining in popularity. So gaining that your licensed content to legitimate online video services will really entice those users away from platforms like Popcorn Time and towards a legitimate platform. And then finally, I think you could try to be more innovative in the way you tackle some of these problems. We've seen a Dutch movie studio, for example, securing a trademark right for a Popcorn Time. So we don't know what exactly is going to happen with that in the next few weeks or months, if they're going to be enforcing their trademark rights. But this is kind of an unusual and more innovative way of dealing with something that's hard to deal with. Sam, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure, just one small thing. I mean, it's important to keep in mind Popcorn Time, while it is kind of an interesting innovation for the peer-to-peer space, it's easiest to think of it simply as a BitTorrent application. And in terms of how it interacts with the network, it behaves very similarly to many other BitTorrent applications. So in terms of the data that we collect, it's absolutely eligible for all the same things. Popcorn Time is really a fancy front-end interface that they've developed to look very much like the legal video-on-demand services. However, behind the scenes, it's still trackers, it's still hashes on the network, leveraging the streaming technology that's been built into BitTorrent. So as long as, the important step for us is to, when innovations or new developments like this occur, is for us to look at those and understand what trackers are they using, what sources are they using for the hashes, to make sure that we're collecting those hashes and not missing anything. And then, really beyond that point, it's just normal data collection. So we can collect cases on Popcorn Time users, and they would be subject to all the same requirements and rules as any other peer-to-peer user. So, yeah.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. Since there seems to be so much known about these P2P networks that contain pirated content, why can't they be taken down? Is it because they also contain legal content, so it's just a matter of identifying which portions are illegal and removing them?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, great question. There's a number of answers to this. Again, some history involved. But in terms of the sites themselves, if we're talking about torrent sites, those sites have often kind of defended themselves based on the fact that they aren't hosting any real content. They simply facilitate it, which they wouldn't even admit that. But they're providing these small torrent files, which allow the peers to connect to each other and then share the infringing content with each other. So that's part of it, is that, they for many years have claimed that, they're not really sharing any copyrighted material. However, we have seen a number of things happen in more recent time where, there's been success in taking some of these sites down because they are clearly purely facilitating piracy. So I don't really think that, having legal parts of their service is as big of a factor. It's more, how these sites have positioned themselves in terms of their involvement in the actual infringing activity. But I think that's changing, and we'll continue to hopefully see some success in getting these sites shut down. it probably is also worth noting that, for the torrent sites themselves, there are some out there that will comply. It's a little different than what we've been talking about today with sending notices to ISPs on the actual peer activity, but there are some options available to sending notices to the torrent sites. There are some sites that comply with removing content when they receive notices. I certainly wouldn't push that as a norm because, the majority of them still stand pretty defiant to it, but there are some sites out there that will comply, and if we know of those sites that exist, it certainly doesn't hurt for content owners to send notices to torrent sites and get that stuff removed. Okay.
Thank you, Olesia and Sam. That was a great presentation today. Thanks for sharing the best practices with our audience today. So I'd like to also thank everyone for tuning in. We had some great questions come in, so that helped draw out more information for those listening in. As a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days, so you can be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.